this evening. Founded in 1823, the Oxford Union was formed by a group of students at the University of Oxford, whose freedom of expression was severely restricted by the university authorities. The early development of the society is accredited to W.E. Gladstone, who learned the power of the freedom of speech as present here in the 1830s, an education that would prove invaluable as he went on to become one of the United Kingdom's greatest ever Prime Ministers. For most of the Union's history, it has been the only place where students have been able to discuss political topics and controversial issues without fear of censorship or reprimanding consequences. The Union's commitment to its founding principles of free speech and open debate is very much still what defines the society's activities today, and the term's events continue to be organised by an entirely democratically elected body of student members. The Union has been so successful as a forward-thinking institution that strives to strengthen democratic values through free and fair discussion because of the illustrious collection of alumni that have made the society what it is today. 5 former British Prime Ministers have been officers here, as well as former Presidents of Pakistan and Sri Lanka. The calibre of our alumni is only matched by the calibre of our guests, having hosted President Reagan and the Dalai Lama amongst several others. It was here that Malcolm X demanded black empowerment by any means necessary. It was here that in his first speech after Watergate, President Nixon admitted, "I screwed up and paid the price." What the Oxford Union believes in, above all else, is freedom of speech, no matter what the reception, nothing more, nothing less. The motion before the House tonight is, this House believes that there is one and only one social responsibility of business, and that is to increase its profits. That was said by Milton Friedman. The rules of the House tonight are as follows. All speakers have a strict 6-minute time cap, and you'll be notified when you have 2 minutes remaining and when you have 30 seconds remaining. Speakers from the floor who speak after the third opposition speaker have a strict 2-minute time cap. All remarks should be addressed to the chair in the form of Madam President, and no speaker should refer to another speaker by their name, but as my honourable colleague or opponent. There are 2 legitimate forms of interruption, points of order or points of information. And these points are introduced with the phrase, on a point of order or on a point of information, respectively. Points of order must refer to the order of the debate and should be introduced to draw the chair's attention to abuse of the forms of the House, which I am currently reading out. Such points take automatic precedence in the proceedings. Points of information must literally be points of information, and not just expression of opinion or questions. A speaker wishing to raise such a point should rise in their seat and wait until the speaker at the dispatch box gives way. If the speaker does not wish to give way, the person raising the point of information must resume their seat. And now I will welcome the speakers this evening. The first opposition speaker tonight will be Nigel Manson. He will be followed by the first opposition speaker, who is David Pitt Watson. Our second opposition speaker tonight is Parth Patel, and our second opposition speaker tonight is Nabila Subadar. Our third opposition speaker tonight is Shreyas Tirunagari, and our third opposition speaker tonight is Christina Partsenevelos. Then we will open up to questions from the floor. There will be a 2-minute time on each question, as I mentioned earlier. The fourth opposition speaker tonight will be Dr. Mungo Wilson, and the fourth opposition speaker tonight will be Colin Melvin. And with that, I open tonight's debate to the first opposition speaker. Thank you.
Good evening. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here this evening. I had no idea that when I signed up to life membership in Freshers Week of the Oxford Union that I would eventually end up speaking here 26 years later. It's taken me a while, so I hope it's worth it. In this modern age of 24-hour news cycles, social media, and short attention spans, it's all too easy to force everything down to sound bites of 140 characters or less. But I'm afraid that I'm old-fashioned. And I believe before we go any further, we should hear the full quote from Milton Friedman about this topic, which is, there is only one social responsibility of business, to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game, which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. There are 2 important elements here. The first is that Friedman is not advocating profiteering or corporate greed at the expense of adherence to the law. So those few bad apples that give incredibly hysterical headlines and talk of violating employment law, breaking health and safety regulations, or accounting discrepancies simply aren't relevant to this debate this evening and shouldn't colour your views on the matter. The second issue is Friedman never talked about a timescale in that statement. He's not saying increase profits this year at the expense of next year. He's just saying increase profits, because he understands, like a true corporate financier, that the value of a business is the net present value of all the future cash flows derived from those profits forever. And as Prince said, that's a mighty long time. Tonight, you will hear my honourable colleagues argue that it is imperative upon companies forged in the crucible of competition to focus on increasing profits, lest they wither and die or are taken over. And you'll also hear that increasing profits is actually socially responsible behaviour. But before we get to that, I think we need to start with some context. If Milton Friedman was writing today, and his writing is still as relevant now as it was then, in this modern age of 24-hour news cycles, social media, etc., his publishers would probably make him send out a tweet, something of the lines of, "Hey, check out my piece in the New York Times. The business of business is business. Hashtag economics, hashtag CSR nonsense." But it begs the question, what is a business? In its simplest terms, a business is a legal construct, a non-sentient, inanimate object that allows us to trade in goods and services with each other. It's no different to a laptop. Imagine a laptop in the hands of a cyber terrorist or a hacker. It's an aggressive weapon capable of much harm. Imagine a laptop in the hands of a digital artist. It's capable, I'll save it for your speech, sir. It's capable of creating something incredibly beautiful. And in the hands of a business person, it's something that is an incredibly powerful research, analytic, and communications tool. Consider a firearm, another inanimate object. An AR-15 in the hands of a United Nations peacekeeper can prevent a genocide. But in the hands of a mentally ill, emotionally disturbed teenager at Columbine High School, it led to utter tragedy. I hope you get the point that the responsibility of business is a meaningless context. What we're talking about are the responsibilities of the people who own and run those businesses. Let's start with those who run the businesses, the corporate executives. They are employees of the owners of businesses and should conduct business in accordance with their desires, no more, no less. In our capitalist society, we should assume the owner's objective function is wealth creation. So the responsibility of the corporate executive is to make as much money as possible whilst conforming to basic rules and laws of society. But the manager is also a person in their own right and may have other responsibilities: family, conscience, church, country, and so on. He's free to devote as much time as he wants to those things in his own time, spending his own resources acting as principal. However, the second he does that on company time, he's no longer acting in the interest of his employer, and that cannot be right. The second he's found out, he's going to get fired and replaced with somebody who will do the job they're paid to do. But what about the owners? Is it right to assume, as I stated earlier, the objective of owners is solely increasing profits, or is there room for other socially responsible objectives? Well, on purely practical grounds, I think it's very sensible that owners give managers one responsibility. Why is that? I've used the term he to talk about managers this evening. It's a sad fact in this world, and I'm a father of a 9-year-old daughter, but most businesses are run by men. Those organisations that are run by women stand out as a minority, and I'm thinking of General Motors with Mary Barra, or Abby Johnson at Fidelity in the US, or Emma Walmsley at GSK in this country, or indeed this august and forward-thinking institution, the Oxford Union. If you know any men, or you are one, you know we're pretty rubbish at multitasking. Just ask my wife. Change a light bulb. I can do that. Do the shopping. I can do that. But pick up the dry cleaning and pick up my daughter from school, you can guarantee we'll have no clothes tomorrow morning and we'll get a call from the headmistress saying, "Where are you?" So a single clear objective is the best way to maximise probability of success. But should that be to increase profits? How about if the owners have socially responsible objectives themselves? Should they not achieve these by imposing them on the businesses they own? Absolutely not. Let's just ask Bill Gates. Do you think the Gates Foundation would be able to achieve what it has achieved if Microsoft had not been so successful and generated so much wealth through its profits? Ask Alfred Nobel. 150 years after his death, the Nobel Foundation is still awarding prizes for significant contributions in mathematics, chemistry, physics, medicine, literature, peace, and economics. How was he able to leave this legacy of extraordinary social contribution that has pushed forward the thinking and development of our society and our species from the profits of his business accumulated over his lifetime? It's no surprise that Milton Friedman, himself a Nobel laureate, argued that the only social responsibility for business is to increase profits. I urge you to vote for the proposition. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Manson for his speech and now welcome Mr. Pitt Watson to open the opposition tonight.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I thought I was clear about what we were supposed to be debating tonight, which was that there was one and only one social responsibility of business. I understand from my honourable opponent that actually we need to caveat that so that this is only in free markets and it only happens if you're doing it within the rules of the game. It only applies where men are the chief executives because they're too stupid and can't multitask, and that in any case the responsibility of business is a meaningless concept. I'd like us to go back to the motion. It's what Milton Friedman said, and it's what we've been asked to debate tonight, which is the responsibility of business is one and one thing only, which is to increase profits. Look, I studied at this university. I did my MBA in the States. I've been privileged enough to be a director of several companies, several of the million companies that there are in this country. I can't think of any of them that conceive of what they do as being solely to increase their profits. Of course they need to make profits. You need to make profits to survive. But I'm a non-executive at KPMG. It's a big accounting firm. One of the things that we need to do is to do good audits. That's part of our responsibility. And by the way, when we don't do that, we get into trouble, as we rightly ought to, if any of you who come from South Africa currently will know. I'm also a director at Oxfam. It's a charity. It's there to help poor people. We have lots of microfinance institutions that we support. They are not there to maximize profits. They are there to help poor people. And I've worked for consulting companies and for fund managers, and we work for profit, of course, but we work for other things as well. And by the way, if I was to talk to my local newsagent or my plumber, I think they would say the same thing. The notion that they have a social responsibility, that they have to increase their profits, do a bit more plumbing, and not go back and see their kids, they'd say that that is plain and utter nonsense. This motion doesn't describe the real world. So it doesn't describe the real world. Maybe Milton Friedman thought it described the world as it ought to be. Well, it doesn't do that either. You know, we have a law in this country, I was a little bit involved in the writing of it, that defines what the responsibilities of the directors of companies that my honourable opponent talked about, what it is. And it's to promote the success of the company for all its members, all its shareholders, after having paid regard to workers, to consumers, to communities, and to other stakeholders. That is the law. Vote for this motion, and you not only vote against normal business practice, you actually vote against what the law is. So why is practice and why is the law that way? It's there because if we didn't have that, we would be in chaos. If business looked for every loophole and tried to exploit every loophole, we would be in chaos. Business simply would not work. Look at every business scandal. And somewhere down there will be somebody who will tell you that they did it because the only responsibility they had was to make more profit. And that undermines business and it undermines capitalism. By the way, I know I am speaking to an international audience, and I know that I am a British person. I'd like you to consider British history. Consider the slave trade. Consider the Opium War. Consider the East India Company breaking the thumbs apocryphally of weavers in Bengal. I bet you they all came back here and told you that their only social responsibility was to maximize their profit. This is a simplistic proposition that is allowed to stand because it makes economic maths easier. But it's not about management. Management's about leadership. Management's about people. Management's about organization. That's what you will learn as you become a master of business administration. You'll learn about obliquity, that in fulfilling a purpose, that is how, as a side effect, companies do maximize their profits. They last, like the great companies of this world, like a Unilever or a Shell, they last for generation after generation. And look, there is a big debate to be had about what the appropriate responsibilities of business are. And they're certainly not limitless. But what Friedman is saying, my honourable opponent, like my honourable friend, will have a chance to speak later, I think. They're not limitless, but what Friedman is saying is that they do have social responsibilities, and that social responsibility is only to make profit. And he's wrong. First, because that's not the way businesses think. Secondly, because if it was, it would be against the law. Third, because if we sign up to this oversimplification, we invite scandalous behavior. And finally, my message to you, as people that will study for an MBA, a master in business administration, is that for any young manager of the future, a great business is one that clearly displays characteristics that go beyond profits. And that is why we must, as people who aspire to be masters of business administration, throw out this totally unacceptable proposition about how we are going to run our careers. Thank you.
And now, welcome Mr. Parth Patel to continue the case for the proposition.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honour to be in front of you today to debate such an important topic. I'm going to explain why it's natural for business to focus on efficiency and profit, and why even when business claims to be focused on social responsibility, it is in fact simply focused on maximizing profit, effectively proving that it's not possible for business to be responsible for anything else. So let's start with the basics, the nature of business and competition. And a product like an iPhone comes into existence when someone, an entrepreneur, identifies an unmet consumer or societal demand and creates a product or service to satisfy that demand. This business must operate within the law and regulations set out by society. In a competitive world, there are many businesses providing the same products and services. The resulting competition forces businesses to be as efficient as possible. Businesses that are less efficient die. So what does it mean to be responsible in business? Investors and owners want a reasonable return for the risk they take, so it's natural to expect some profit. Competitive market forces and regulation ensure that customers cannot be taken advantage of. Laws and regulations ensure that labour cannot be exploited. Royalties and taxes ensure that society receives fair benefit for any environmental or natural capital that is consumed in delivering a product. And finally, tax on profits ensures that society gets its fair share of benefit from business to spend in whichever societal cause it wishes. You can therefore say, as Friedman does, that business tries to maximize profit while operating within the law is doing social good and is being socially responsible. The opposition may try to point to examples of business exploiting natural or human capital, primarily in developing countries where there can be a poorer governance structure. But this only happens because society allows it. And if one business does it, the others need to, just in order to compete. So now let's look at the nature of the consumer. The fact is that the vast majority of us blindly buy products and services from companies like Disney, Apple, Walmart, H&M, and many others, despite news stories of questionable working practices and labour or environmental issues. So why do we do this? And if we do this, how can we expect business to act responsibly when we are happy to continue to buy their products regardless? How can we expect businesses to act responsibly and raise the bar when their competitors will eat their market share and their profits if they attempt to act responsibly? It's only when we as a society and as consumers show that we care more about certain issues and stand up against certain practices, when companies feel that their brand reputation and ultimately their profits are at risk, will they change their behaviour? Profit drives everything. It is human nature, and therefore it is the nature of the corporation too. Social responsibilities are down to society. Business responsibility is to make profit. You've had your first responsible business lecture today and probably heard about things such as CSR, corporate social responsibility. An example of this would be Tom's, the shoemaker, trying to be socially responsible by giving a pair of shoes to the needy for every pair that is bought. They try to use social responsibility to give them a competitive edge. And they end up putting local cobblers out of business. Wouldn't it have been better, more socially efficient, for them to make a little bit more profit and pay a little bit more tax? Ask yourself critically, is Tom's an example of responsible business or simply a strategy to maximize profits? I urge you not to be naive. Understand that business is competitive by nature and cannot do anything except to try to maximize profits, even when it shows itself to be acting responsibly. Shreyash will speak about this a bit further later on. So to summarize, I've tried to show you that competition ensures customers are not taken advantage of. Compliance with law ensures that human, natural, social, and other forms of capital are not exploited. Maximization of profit is efficient and results in social good. Even when businesses such as Tom's claim to be acting in a socially responsible manner, they are ultimately trying to increase their profits, with social responsibility being their marketing strategy. The nature of individuals means that free, competitive business cannot be trusted to hold any further responsibility other than the pursuit of profits. Understand that social responsibility lies with individuals and with society as a whole, and it's implemented via rules, laws, regulations, our purchasing habits as consumers, and not with a rational corporate entity that has no moral conscience. It is irresponsible and naive of us to try to pass the burden of societal responsibility onto business. As part of the top 1% of society, it's for you to recognize this and lead the way. Be aware that the rest of the world doesn't necessarily think or behave the way you do, so be responsible yourself. Educate consumers to think about the things that are important for society. It is on you, not the entity of business, to lead the way and to act responsibly. You lead, business will follow. So once you finish listening to the opposition, please remember that business has only one responsibility, to increase profits, and that individuals have a responsibility to force changes in business behavior to the betterment of society. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and now welcome Ms. Nabila Subedar to continue the case of the opposition.
Madam President, honourable opponents and colleagues, and the Oxford MBA class of 2017-2018, Good evening. If you'd allow me, let's do a little bit of time travel. It's something that we do on this MBA. Imagine yourself 1 year from today. So you've just completed the MBA, and you've heard Tufano's big speech at the Sheldonian, and you're about to look at, well, essentially go into the working world. You're currently assessing an employment contract that comes from a textile employer. And this is an incredibly profitable company. In fact, it's offering a really, really good salary. There's just one snag. One of the reasons of the profitability of this company is because it has many cost-cutting schemes, one of which is using foreign suppliers. And in these foreign suppliers, they tend to sometimes use child labor. Now, how many of you in this room, knowing that, would still want to accept that offer and work for that company? Anybody? This is a CPA question. Okay, I thought so. I mean, but why not? What's the issue here? Are they not necessarily being within the rules of the game? If in those countries there are gray areas about whether or not something is legal, like child labor. And that is what my honorable opponents will try and convince you about this evening. But clearly, something is amiss here. And in convincing you to try and walk out the left-hand side of that door, I'm going to touch on 3 points this evening. Firstly, looking at what the trust implicit in business is about. Secondly, in looking at the purpose of the organization and the corporation. And thirdly, in debunking this myth that there's a dichotomy between the interests of stakeholders and shareholders, as we've seen some of the opponents, my honorable opponents, bringing up earlier on. And may I just say that the argument today is not about the limitless social responsibility of business, but rather that the one and only one social responsibility of business is to make profits. So let's have a look at trust. In today's world, and I'm pretty sure you heard this in Colin Mayer's lecture, we have corporations that are larger than entire nation states. I mean, Walmart itself is apparently the 10th largest economic entity in the world, standing before 95% of all the countries in the world. That's a bit crazy. These corporations have become inextricably linked in our idea of living our day-to-day lives. So unsurprisingly, there's a very important component of the relationship between business and society, and that is trust. But somehow, Milton Friedman seems to think that we operate in some sort of vacuum that's separate from society. The foundation of business is not based on a set of neatly compiled contracts, but rather a rather messy and intricate web of relationships that's centered on trust itself. And many companies have learned this lesson. I mean, it's not too long ago that we can recall the VW scandal, where they decided to selectively activate certain emission controls to pass environmental regulations. And I know that my oppositions will stand up and say, but hang on, Milton Friedman said that you have to play within the rules of the game, and they were deceptive, and they were clearly fraudulent. And I agree with that. But this is where the waters get really, really muddy. I mean, the rules of the game tends to change depending on where you go. So, for example, in Cambodia, bribery is fairly commonplace, with more than 70% of public firms receiving bribe requests. And just 3 years ago in Bolivia, child labor was essentially legalized, so kids as young as 10 years old could by law be employed as contracted laborers. Now, companies that pay these kickbacks and employ these children are technically playing within the rules of the game, but it has dire consequences on trust. Trust itself is linked to the purpose of the company. And I decided to have a brief look at the Walmart 2017 annual report, considering it is the 10th largest economic entity. And in it, the CEO, Doug McMillon, mentioned Walmart's purpose itself. It said, "We save people money so they can live better." Nowhere in there did they say that their purpose is profits, because the purpose of a company is something larger than that. Profits are a byproduct of the purpose of the company. And let's be clear here, to my honorable opponents, I'm not standing here today asking you to consider companies to be charitable institutions. Oxford's own Professor Will Hutton makes this case, in that the accumulated evidence from across the world is that improved profit performance follows the pursuit of purpose, the clearly articulated and self-conscious insistence shared by managers and owners alike that a company first exists to promote societal and human betterment. And what if this dichotomy, this idea that there's a social responsibility and a business responsibility? As my honorable opponents would have tried to convince you, as Milton Friedman did in 1970, that there's a fundamental trade-off between the interests of the shareholders on one hand and all other societal actors. Please hold that off. Friedman frames the argument, as I'm sure my honorable opponent will, as a zero-sum game, essentially saying that it's an all or nothing. But what evidence is there to suggest that such a trade-off exists? The answer is there is none. And as a leading scholar quite eloquently put, and I quote, There wasn't proof in 1970, and there isn't proof today, that 100% focus on shareholder value to the exclusion of societal factors actually produces a high value for shareholders. Ladies and gentlemen, Oxford MBA graduates, or soon-to-be graduates of the class of 2017 and 2018, you are the future business leaders of the world. I urge you, as you walk out that door, to consider this entire debate from a utilitarian perspective. And that's the question to ask, that if every company acted the way that a textile company that was going to offer you a job was supposed to act, would you be happy to live in a world like that? So this evening, I would ask you to walk through the left of the door and to reject the motion that the one and only one social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. Thank you very much.
For her speech, and now look to the third proposition speaker, Shreyas Tirunagari, to continue the case.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson, the Honourable House, my esteemed opponents, and my fellow speakers. I start first to talk about what our opposition has said today. They have been luring you into a trap of lies. I ask you, and I urge you, do not fall into it. Resist. Resist the temptation as tempting as it may be. The first, we have heard recently, right now, that how many of you would buy clothes if the clothes are manufactured in a country where child labor is employed? I will not even ask you for a show of hands, but I'm quite positive that someone out here is wearing H&M, someone's wearing Gap. I'm reasonably sure somebody has bought paracetamol from a company called GlaxoSmithKline, or from Novartis, or from Pfizer, and these companies engage in questionable, unethical practices that happen day in and day out. How many times do we as individuals walk up to a pharmacy and check if, is this drug, did you engage in some child labor when you made this drug? Did you go and test it on people that was unethical? The shifting of responsibility, ladies and gentlemen, onto the consumer for the ethical burdens of a society that is as complex as ours is an outrageous suggestion, and I ask you to reject it. That's the first. Moving to the second bit, which is we heard a while back that at some point of time colonization was justified on the basis of profit pursuit. I think there's a significant gap between the truth and the pursuit of colonization. Back in the day, colonization happened, and it happened as an act of civility. It was the larger objective, for the larger justification for colonization was to civilize uncivilized societies. It had no basis in profit pursuit, and it is on the basis of these blurred lines that we have seen outrageous acts being committed over centuries. I ask this House to think about reason and rationality, not about what your heart speaks to you. Oh, wow. Now, on to some of the reasons why we, on the proposition, believe that the pursuit of profit is a noble pursuit and that it should be the one and only social responsibility of business. The first reason is measurement. Ladies and gentlemen, think about it for a moment. If you can't measure something, would you believe it? Would you believe it if I told you something was this big, or this big, maybe this big? How would you measure it? Profit gives us a basis for measurement. Profit is numbers. Profit is units. We know the gap between 0 and -2, 0 and +10. That is significant in our understanding of how an organization works. The pursuit of social responsibility is not measurable. Sure, we have heard in recent times about things like carbon credits, but would a shopkeeper sitting in Surat, Gujarat know what a carbon credit is? Yes.
There are indeed many measures of responsibility in business. I chair the Future Fit Foundation, which has a series of benchmarks for sustainability in every sector. It is happening right now.
I agree with you, of course. There are measures. I ask how widespread. I ask this House to consider how widespread are these measurements. You know, if you went into Uganda, to rural Uganda, you would find that people understand what a kilometer is. I ask you, does the society, the world we live in, do they acknowledge and understand? Is the information flow spreading that far? And therefore, do we have a social responsibility to exist, to conduct business in a way that measures what is responsible to the society at large, not the ivory towers of 10 universities such as ours. The second is the absence of a law against hypocrisy. Ladies and gentlemen, there are companies that talk about social responsibility, that talk about doing good for society, but are then engaging in unethical practices. This is an age of information flow. This is an age in which information travels far and wide and is controlled by organizations with the click of a mouse. In this age, it is easy to deceive, it is easy to fraud, and it is incredibly easy to masquerade as something you are not. In this age, we must put a block on hypocrisy. What the opposition on this side argues is to enable companies to employ cloak and dagger tactics. It enables organizations to do one thing and say one thing. That is a dangerous precedent. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard about people like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Bill Gates, or Warren Buffett. These are men, these are individuals who have made vast contributions to business and to society. There is a gap between what they have done for the company, for their company, with their company, and what they have done as individuals. The Bill Gates Foundation is incredibly successful at curing some of the social ills that exist on this planet. Microsoft as a company is incredibly successful in solving some technological problems. That is a dichotomy, that's a gap that exists. Unlike what the opposition would have you believe, that is not a gap between shareholders and stakeholders, that is a gap between what the company can do and what the individual can do. We repeat, what an individual can do is the pursuit of social benefit, because that can be measured. What the company can do is the pursuit of profit, because that too can be measured. And by the law of nature, it must, by default, continue to grow. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I would now take a rest. I urge you to consider and think with your mind, think with the reason, think with rationality, and not with what the heart tells you to. Because this is the world of business, and you are business students. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and now welcome Christina Parts-Never to continue the case of the opposition.
I think just after that speech, I've got to reiterate the motion, which is there is one and only one social responsibility of business: to increase profit. Nothing else was said after that motion. That's the line. There's nothing else there. Pretty simple, right? Maybe some would say oversimplified. What I'm saying is this statement is almost 50 years old and is no longer relevant to economists, let alone business leaders and managers. Thank you, Chairperson, members of the House, current class of 2017-2018. I stand here today to oppose this motion because it's grossly oversimplified, and it's oversimplifying the realities of business. The motion in its proposed form is in fact much longer. And it's funny that the first speaker actually had to preface that, had to say, well, guys, listen up. There's one sentence, but there's a few more details that maybe you should all know so that you vote with them. Do we really do that in debating? Do we have to preface all of these other things? Still have a minute. So if we're going forward with this, when you fail to expound this principle in its entirety, you leave room for misinterpretation, as we have seen with the proposition. So show of hands here, who chose Said because of its influence or its engagement with social impact? What does that mean? And you just said you are business students. You are business students, so please, I urge you to vote with the proposition. Go ahead. I know you have something for me.
The number of people that have chosen Said for social impact do not necessarily want to go into charity. They want to.
Oh, I'm not talking about charity. I'm not talking about charity. I am stating right now that the motion is incorrect, that it's not solely about it's not solely about profits, increasing profits. There's more to it, which I'm going to allude to in a second, so I can address that if you let me continue. Now I'm going to pick on the first speaker of the proposition. He actually said to, I think this is the first time that Said now has about almost 40% females, so congrats on that. Wait, no, I have to quote you first before you interrupt me. He actually said that because mostly men are running corporations, that they should only have one priority because they can't multitask. Did we actually hear that come out of your mouth?
Within context, I said it's a sad state of affairs.
But you still said it's something that because of that, we should continue to propel that cycle that only men should lead these corporations because they one-track mind. But I'm going to continue on because you actually mentioned corporations, public corporations, and let's go back to the Oxford Dictionary, which defines a corporation as a large company or group of companies authorized to act as a single entity and recognized as such in law. So that just a lot of people just glazed over. So let me continue. It is an artificial person under the law which has many of the same legal rights as an actual person. And then you might argue, no, that's not true. But the second speaker said, and I quote, "It's human nature to increase profits, and therefore it's the nature of the business." I don't even have to continue. You argued that point for me. What I'm saying is that corporations should be bound by social obligations and not solely focus on selfish profiteering. And I gotta go to another point here on the proposition, and that was about society, and that it's society's issue. We all buy H&M, we buy Zara because it's cheap, and we die because Takata airbags go off or suffer from VW emissions, but it's our issue. It's society's issue. We buy cheap paracetamol from GSK. It's our issue if we die. Oh, if you're British, there's Sainsbury, the chocolate bits for their dogs. The dogs are getting sick. But it's our issue. Really, what I'm saying right now is corporations are so large, their net value is as big as the GDP of several nations. Therefore, they are integrated in society and need to have the social responsibilities that come with that. So I want to actually get to my points or my arguments since I've just been rebutting this entire time. The motion proposed to you today is wrong for two main reasons. Firstly, large corporations and businesses have fundamentally changed our society of today. Take Google, Facebook, name all the big guys. For example, think of how different our lives are today because of these businesses. Friedman's principle is based on the unrealistic idea that companies are best left unfettered to make profits, as we've heard many times here, as they see fit, with the only controls being exerted by free market forces. This is a deeply flawed viewpoint. Whether we like it or not, corporations of today are firmly integrated in our everyday lives. Therefore, corporations must assume some social responsibility because they are a part of the very fabric of society. Secondly, if you believe that seeking profit is the only social responsibility of a company, then you, the new MBA class, accept Friedman's premise that there has to be a trade-off between prioritizing shareholder values and nurturing other societal norms. Which means that focusing solely on profits is not enough. Only by taking responsibility for key issues like pollution, employees' welfare, or human rights will long-term success be ensured. In this lies the fundamental flaw of the motion. Corporations do not exist in isolation, and focusing only on profits is short-sighted. By engaging in society and taking a whole, and ensuring their own long-term success. As bright, new Said MBA students, it's time we rewrite these archaic models. I urge you to vote with the opposition and just head out on the left side of the door. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for her